start. I see that the number of participants is still going up, which is a good sign, but I hope that everyone who joins a few minutes late will forgive me that I have already started. Welcome everyone to our event with Alena Douhan today. Of course, most of all, welcome to Alena Douhan. I hope you can see me. You're a tiny bit frozen on my screen at the moment. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So welcome everyone to this event, which is jointly organized by the Interest Group on International Human Rights Law by the European Society of International Law and the Institute on the International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict at Ruhr University, Bochum. My name is Pierre Thielbörger, and our guest today is Alena Douhan. This will take the form of an interview. We hope this way we can be very interactive. So we have agreed that I will only ask a few questions to Alena after a short introduction. She will try to keep her answers short so that the second half of our session today from around 5:30, hopefully, or 5:35, we have entirely reserved for your questions, which you can pose via the chat function. Let me quickly start by introducing Alena. Alena Douhan is a professor of international law at the Belarusian State University in Minsk. She has, over the last half year, been a visiting professor at Ruhr University, Bochum, which was a great pleasure to have her with us. And most importantly, maybe, she is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures for the enjoyment of human rights, a long title. Her research, probably not surprising, is in the field of international law, human rights law, but also international organizations, dispute settlement, security law, and so on. As a special rapporteur, I should maybe say for those with what special rapporteurs are, she is part of what is called special procedures of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is a big group of independent experts, special rapporteurs, working groups on specific human rights related topics. That can be thematic topics, like in Alena's case, on coercive measures, or it can relate to specific countries. Alena has taken up this position in spring last year as a United Nations Special Rapporteur. And in that capacity last year, she has already visited one state to give a report to the United Nations, which is the state of Qatar. I've lost her picture now. I hope she is coming back. Can I still be heard? Will, can you maybe tell me?
Yes, and I switched off and back the video. Hopefully it shall be better.
Okay, but is it my video or is it yours, Alena?
My video was off and now I turned it on back again.
Okay, am I understandable, Will?
Yeah, you can be understood. I think it's just a slight problem with Alena's camera at the moment.
Okay, we hope we can get the camera back. Well, as I said, she was last year. She was in Qatar. We'll talk about that a bit, maybe. And there's some messages. Well, I hope you monitor that. The last weeks, she was actually in Venezuela. And that is what we're going to talk about as well today for a big part of our talk. The sanctions that Venezuela faces since the 2000s have been strengthened in the last 5 years quite significantly by the United States and others. So this will be one of our topics today. And in her visit to Venezuela, she has spoken to the government, to President Maduro. She's spoken to the opposition. She has spoken to humanitarian organizations. She has spoken to the church, to civil society groups, to essentially everyone you can imagine. And before I have my first question to Alena, which I hope by then we can also see again, that would of course be a lot nicer. I want to quickly recap what she said in this report. The preliminary findings are published by now, so we can actually read them. And they are quite strong in language, let's say. The official report, of course, will be delivered to the Human Rights Council later this year, but the preliminary findings say, there you say, Alena, I hope you can hear me now, that you urge the United States, the European Union, and other states to drop the sanctions imposed against Venezuela immediately. You describe the crisis that Venezuela is in, a crisis that Venezuela was already in before the recent sanctions being imposed against it. It had already a few years ago the highest inflation rate in the world, and that has just become now worse. And it is now, the country is now, the civil population is now facing a severe shortages also of all basic goods you can imagine. Agricultural activity, which is so important for the country, has essentially stopped, mainly because diesel is no more imported. You report in your preliminary findings of malnourishment of families who have to sell their homes, families who have to send their children into child labor. And you make a point specifically about the US sanctions that are so dramatic. The embargo that is imposed since 2019 has really essentially, strangled the entire economy completely. That has now led to a big problem of people leaving the country. So we have by now 5 million people who have left Venezuela over the last 5 years. And many of them highly qualified, which is of course highly qualified labor, which then misses in the economy. I said already, you described that essentially all essential goods are scarce, you name it, water, food, electricity, medicine, everything is in dire need. You describe very neatly the situation of vulnerable groups, of women, of children, of people in extreme poverty, native, indigenous populations, people with disabilities. You highlight how extreme their situation is. And altogether, you conclude, and I'm quoting here, that the sanctions have a devastating effect on human rights, in particular the right to life, health, food, education, and development. And you describe these violations as unjust, these breaches as unjustifiable. And you even see a violation of the principle of sovereign equality of Article 2, number 1 of the United Nations Charter in these sanctions that have been imposed against Venezuela. So I think it's fair to say this is a very clear finding. There's no doubt that you see this as violations. But before we talk about Venezuela, and only about Venezuela, I first hope that you are still there, because now you have left.
She'll be back in a second. She's trying to restart to get her video running again. She just messaged me, so hopefully she'll be back in momentarily.
Okay, maybe I can talk a bit more about the report, or about, there she is back. Great. That looks better. You're back?
Yes, I'm back. Hopefully everyone can see me.
I've tried. Yes, finally we can see you. And I have tried to summarize in the last few minutes your preliminary findings. So you can now say whether I summarized them correctly. You just have to believe me. And I've said that they are quite clear. You found very clear human rights violations, and even a violation of the principle of sovereign equality of states. My first question before we talk about Venezuela is, about these coercive measures, unilateral coercive measures, about sanctions. Would you not agree that sometimes they are needed in international relations? Are they not a means to get states exactly to respect and to protect the human rights that they have to respect or to protect vis-a-vis their own population? Would you say there are situations where unilateral coercive measures are maybe in exceptional cases needed, or would you categorically say no?
Well, that's a very complicated question, and I have a feeling that my most complicated task will be to keep it short, the responses short. Let's see, indeed, there is sometimes a need to put some pressure on the states which probably act in violation of their international obligations. But I can't answer your question either yes or no, taking into account that we do not know what we mean when we speak about sanctions. Because unfortunately today, everyone uses various definitions, and we speak about unilateral coercive measures, unilateral sanctions, sanctions, restrictive measures, or whatever else. And as a result, we are going somewhere like quite far beyond the traditional legal terminology. From my point of view, the main idea is that in order to protect human rights, every state is to act in accordance with international law. International law provides a number of means to suppress other states. In the extreme case, there is a possibility of sanctions of the UN Security Council, and we all are aware about that. In some cases, it's possible just not to cooperate with states. States are free to decide to withdraw from international treaties, to conclude treaties, to provide some loans or technical assistance, or decided not to do that. And that's, again, absolutely legal. It's also possible to impose countermeasures in specific cases in accordance with the law of international responsibility. And again, when we speak about the situation when international crimes are committed, there are mechanisms of international criminal law. And I'm speaking not only about the ICC cases, I'm also speaking about the well-known principle of universal jurisdiction when international crimes are committed. And from my perspective, I believe that all these measures, which are used sometimes and also called sanctions, they definitely are not unilateral coercive measures. They all are legal. They all are nice means to apply to states.
Let me rephrase my question then. So what about import and export bans? I think this is the main thing which I took from your report is the problem. Like import and export bans, can they ever be legal in international law in your view?
If treaties will, let's say, if a state will decide to withdraw, for example, from the international treaty on the protection of investments, or decide to stop a treaty on cooperation or economic cooperation, that will be legal. But that's not about import and export bans. That's why, from the point of international law, that's illegal. And the report on Venezuela and basically the situation in Syria clearly shows the enormous humanitarian impact of this sort of activity. And what I was willing to mention, probably what is important, unfortunately, states are now forgetting about existing means, like, for example, the mechanism of criminal law. There are numerous cases existing today. For example, I will mention Thielbörger, very known, very famous for everyone. The United States, for example, has listed 6 Nigerian IT persons for IT fraud against the US nationals. That's a clear case for criminal, to bring them for criminal responsibility, but criminal cases are not started. Instead of, the mechanism of unilateral sanctions is imposed. But the same and even higher purpose will be reached if we use the mechanism of criminal responsibility.
Okay, my second question would go in the direction of support through states. I mean, we all know international law is a legal order that's based on the consent of states, on the cooperation of states. And I mean, you have the mandate since a year, and I'm sure you would agree with me that probably the mandate can only be successful if to a certain degree you are supported by states and states will cooperate with you. So now my question is, which states are cooperating with you? Is it only those that I would expect that are the ones against whom sanctions have been imposed? No surprise that they find it good that someone from the United Nations comes and tells, you know, oh, these sanctions violate human rights. Or do you feel the support also from those states who have actually enacted sanctions against other states? Do you feel this divide that those states who are kind of like who face sanctions themselves support your mandate, and the other states, like the US, for instance, are more hesitant, let's say, towards your mandate?
That's again a very interesting question. I believe that this mandate is one of those which cause an enormous discrepancy between states. And for a pretty long period of time, sanctioning and sanctioned states were not cooperating at all as concerned this mandate. If you look at the results of vote on the resolutions within that mandate, it's usually 2/3 in favor of the resolution and 1/3 is strictly against the resolution. Nearly no one is abstaining. on the situation. And I would say that the initial idea of the mandate is that naturally the proponents were the states which are suffering because of sanctions. It has also been supported by a number of states which have not been sanctioned, but which still believe that application of unilateral coercive measures is strictly against international law. And those states which impose sanctions traditionally vote against the mandate, and moreover, they were insistent that there is no need to have this mandate because there is no such a notion as unilateral coercive measures. But at the same time, I need to know that I can observe a pretty substantial development within the last year. The voting results have not changed. I hope it will at a certain point, but they haven't changed by now. At the same time, even within 1 year of my practice, I see the willingness of the sanctioning states to cooperate. Well, I need to mention that, for example, at the very beginning, a year ago, I didn't receive any responses from the sanctioning states. Now, for example, when I was in Qatar, I had a meeting with all the ambassadors present there, and the meeting was organized by the US ambassador. When I was in Venezuela, there was a huge meeting organized by the European Union ambassadors, and I had a chance to meet them all. Now I start to receive invitations to participate in the discussion of, for example, Global Human Rights Act adopted recently within the European Union at the level now of the European Union and Switzerland. The European Union is changing its guidances as concerned the problems of sectoral sanctions, or for example, secondary sanctions or overcompliance. And that's why I can't say that the answer to the question is absolutely some are strictly against, some are strictly in favor. My position is that we shall act in accordance with international law and to build the dialogue. And I see certain tiny steps done over here. And the last point which I want to refer here is the recent statement by the new US administration, which has been done after my visit to Venezuela, when the US administration agreed that application of the US sanctions on Venezuela, yes, it had enormous humanitarian impact.
Let's quickly go before we turn to Venezuela, because I'm sure most people are probably interested in this the most, but let's for once a moment go back to what you just mentioned, which is your visit last year, Qatar. I mean, do you, first of all, I mean, maybe for those who don't know, you know, I mean, a lot of other Arab states had sanctions against Qatar for various allegations supporting terrorism, for instance. And you went there as well, and you came back to Europe and you said, you know, oh, we see all those human rights violations that are caused by the sanctions. We see suffering of the civil population. But then at the same time in Qatar, you know, even today, we read again, like, you know, how horrible the human rights record of some states is. If you think about forced labor, for instance, in the case of Qatar now, in the preparation of the World Cup, do you not sometimes, and then these states celebrate, you know, they put in their newspapers, the United Nations independent experts defends us, you know. Do you sometimes feel a bit, I don't want to say abused by states, but do you sometimes feel a bit states take advantage of what you actually try to do, which is to speak out in favor of the population, while then governments try to also take you under their wing and say she has spoken out in our favor? You feel that sometimes?
Generally speaking, I would say that the question is much broader. I believe everyone is trying to take advantage of what I'm speaking. For example, I will cite here the example of Venezuela. There was enormous hate speech in my Twitter, absolutely forgetting about the purpose of the country visit, just disliking the main conclusions. Therefore, I believe that the purpose of establishment of the special procedures is not to prevent any interpretation by the government or opposition or anyone else. The purpose is to identify the facts of human rights violation, of absence of these facts, and to recommend some improvements in this sphere. And here, the important point is to remember that, for example, when we speak about my mandate, the purpose is not only to do recommendations to the sanctioning states. Lots of recommendations, both after the Qatar visit and after Venezuela visit, are addressed to the government to prevent any violation of human rights. In the situation of Qatar, as far as there are lots of cases, for example, of separated families and children being unable to get IDs, students being unable to receive the academic records and to complete their studies, as well as the economic rights, violation of economic rights. Some recommendations were addressed to Qatar government to improve its legislation and to cooperate more intensive with international organizations. And I would say that in the case of Qatar, for example, Qatar did a lot of work within the last couple of years to improve cooperation with the UN Counterterrorism Committee, with ILO, with International Organization on Migration and so forth, especially, and even the Refugee Agency. That was really a new development in this part of the world. Especially, you have mentioned the point of the forced labor. Qatar was changed at the period of my visit. Qatar has just changed the legislation to change from the traditional sponsorship contracts for foreign workers to the normal system of employment. And that's why I believe that the visits of special rapporteurs in the broader context help to improve situation in different countries. And in my case, in the country which is visited and which is under sanctions as well.
Okay, let's now turn to Venezuela, because you just returned. First of all, let me say we are happy that you returned safely and healthy. One of the probably most interesting talks I'm sure you had was with the president, with Mr. Maduro. So my first question is simply, what was your impression of this talk? How did you experience him and how he presented the situation in Venezuela? But also, how was the reaction from civil society, from media, that you actually met with him? Was there also criticism because you met him?
I believe that I will start answering this question a little bit like from the far point. I need to mention, first of all, the methodology of country visits. To be able to verify all information and to make a comprehensive report, the idea is to meet all interlocutors and take into account that the political situation in Venezuela is extremely complicated. And indeed, as you have correctly noted at the very beginning, the economic situation in Venezuela was far from perfect and even far from good, even before sanctions have been imposed. For me, it was really extremely important to meet not only governmental officials, but all different groups of opposition. And in Venezuela, that's not an opposition as a general group. There are various groups of opposition. I made 5 different groups of them, to meet various NGOs, both pro-governmental and counter-governmental, to meet trade unions. And I need to mention that to guarantee impartiality and verify the facts, I met various groups, pro and counter-governmental, for every type of interlocutors: private business, pro-governmental, counter-governmental, academia, pro and counter, trade unions, victims of violations, hospitals, NGOs, international organizations, states which impose sanctions, and states which are against sanctions. So generally speaking, I was having like 10, 11 hours of meetings every day to be able to cover all the interlocutors. And naturally, indeed, as far as the question of sanctions is very important for Venezuela, I had a meeting with the president of the country. I need to say that he presented the position of the country. He presented the situation and the impact of sanctions. And I need to admit that however criticized I was for saying that and fixing it in the report, I received all factual and statistical information I requested from the government. So I never had a case that the government said, no, we won't provide you this information. Naturally, when we speak about the statistics, and I hope that...
do you trust all the information that they gave you?
That's the second question. I will come a little bit later to that. So the second point is that basically every governmental official, including president, were answering the questions I asked. However, I need to mention that some of the questions I asked were not about how bad sanctions are. Some of the questions I asked were about the Venezuela anti-blockade law, and especially the secrecy provisions in the Venezuela anti-blockade law, which is criticized a lot. Some questions I asked were about the functioning of non-governmental humanitarian organizations, and there was a case of Azure Positive participants. That's an NGO which has been arrested 2 weeks before I came for Venezuela country visit. And the criminal case was started with the reference that they misuse funds. And that's why I was asking question about the mechanism which are used to guarantee security of functioning of humanitarian organizations, absence of prosecution and surveillance. And if you look at the recommendations of my report, I recommend the government to work with the United Nations to draft clear and transparent legislation for registration of NGOs to guarantee their security and impartiality. And that's one of the recommendations. My recommendations are not limited only, please lift sanctions. They are they also include the references to the secrecy clauses of Qatar anti-blockade law. So basically, I address the government to make situation and legislation better than they were. And now I come to the point of statistics. Naturally, it's usually sad how we can trust the government. And that's why I was asking everyone I met to provide me statistics and information we have. Just to describe you the situation, before I came to Venezuela, I received around 70 mails with responses to the questionnaires and statistics from various NGOs, pro-governmental, anti-governmental, academic statistics, and so forth. When we were in Venezuela, I asked for information every person I met, starting from when we speak about opposition, all 5 groups of opposition, including Guaido, to provide me with information. And naturally, I was trying to compare these statistics afterwards. I have to admit that sometimes I can't verify it completely. For example, you were mentioning that there are 5 million of migrants from Venezuela. Venezuela government insists that that's 1 or 1.2 million of migrants. There is different information and I can't verify, and that's why, for example, in the report, it said that in accordance to differing data, 1 to 5 million of migrants. But quite often, it's possible to see the specific cases. So when I was referring to specific data, it meant that it's verified from both governmental and non-governmental sources. And sometimes to verify information, what I can do is to see the tendency. I will give you an example, for example, of the maternal mortality and neonatal mortality. Figures provided by the governmental and non-governmental sources differ a lot. However, they show the same dynamic. Starting from 2016, when the medical assistance sanctions have been imposed and medical assistance from the government stopped, there was enormous rise, enormous. Naturally, the figures of the government and non-government are different, but they show the same rise. Starting from 2019, when the government has concluded a cooperation agreement with UNICEF and PAHO, and UNICEF and PAHO started to provide vaccines and medical care, this graphic comes down. I do not know what exact figure was the top point and what the exact figure is now. But what I see that there was increase either in 2 or in 4 times immediately after sanctions have been imposed. And here I can verify the tendency, but I can't verify the figure.
So I want to go back to what your impression of President Maduro really was. Like, what kind of guy is he? I mean, how was your impression? That's my question you haven't answered. And the second question is, you also spoke to the opposition, right? I guess you spoke to different groups. I assume you spoke to Juan Guaido in particular as well. What is their stance on the unilateral measures? Are they also equally opposed to them as the government, or are they actually in some ways even in favor of them because they see it as the only way to force the government? Sorry, the first question was a bit inappropriate, but nonetheless, I mean, we don't get the chance often to speak to someone who's just spoken to Mr. Maduro.
when I had the possibility to talk to the president of Venezuela, naturally it wasn't a sort of friendly talk. That was a protocol meeting, naturally. But what I need to mention that he was handling all information, really knowing the information. I got impression that he was eager to at least listen to the recommendation because he was taking notes of what I said and the question which I asked, and he responded to the question. And as far as the purpose of my visit is to start building dialogue, I want to hope that that is a sign of the dialogue. And I believe that it's true, taken into account that it's reported by the UN agency that the government is cooperating with the UN more and more since 2019. There are several agreements concluded in this sphere. That's why I would say that my impression was that at least he was ready to listen to recommendation as such, because naturally when I do the meetings with state officials, I always say about the principles of the country visit reports, and I always say about the cooperation, about the need to cooperate and start the dialogue, and the prohibition of non-reprisals. As concerned the question on opposition, as I said, I met 5 different opposition groups, and that's sometimes interesting that...
Sorry, can I ask, would you meet any opposition group? I mean, what about illegal groups? You wouldn't meet them, right?
To tell the truth, I haven't met any group which said that we are a criminal group.
No, I'm sure they wouldn't say that, Alena, but I mean, you probably do your research before you go into the country. So is there like a red line? Because you said you meet everyone, and I can't imagine that you really do. I mean, no?
As I said, I didn't meet anyone who pretended to be like a sort of organized criminal group or whatever else, but I need to say, I mean, I'm a special rapporteur. I'm not doing the organizational work. The organizational work is done by the office in Geneva plus UNDP in the country. Mm-hmm. So they are in the country. There are 4 people working from the Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner in Venezuela, so they know what opposition groups are acting over there, and they proposed me to group them into 5 different groups, depending on, I would say, whether they are radical, critical, moderate, cooperative, and so forth. That's why, I mean, I couldn't know in details. That was a recommendation from the side of the United Nations, which I have to follow. Anyway, well, as concerns meeting with opposition, it's a little bit, I had an interesting experience, because I told all of them that our meetings are all under confidentiality rule. I'm not disclosing any information whom I met. There is a principle of non-reprisals. However, nearly all of them tweeted information about our meeting the same day we had that. However, a day before I presented my report, preliminary assessment report, several opposition leaders said, no, she didn't meet us, although the same people did the tweets that they did. And they said that they believe that my schedule was done by the government. Also, upon my assessment, around 55–60% were devoted to meetings with non-governmental institutions. And we did it with a purpose, knowing that there will be a political problem. Well, as concerns your question about the approach towards sanctions, I believe that it's necessary to speak a little bit broader, probably not only about opposition, but also about the civil sector. Because naturally, opposition has its own political purposes, and the approach towards sanctions depends on how radical they are or how cooperative they are. Some groups of opposition which cooperate with the government, they are against sanctions. So that here I speak about the opposition groups which took part in the recent elections, parliamentary elections in January. And what's interesting, that those opposition leaders which took part in parliamentary elections, they have been listed by the European Union for participation in elections, although they are leaders of opposition parties. just because they participated in the elections. No crimes are alleged to these people. They never committed any.
About the question, how do they see the sanctions? What's their
now I'm coming to that point. Naturally, those opposition groups which participated in elections and some other which are not very radical, they are admitting that sanctions harm people a lot. And they are naturally concerned. They are speaking about the possible corruption and the probably high level of corruption. They speak about organized crime and so forth. But they say that, yes, the country needs sanctions to be withdrawn, but it needs international control. And that's why, again, I will refer to my recommendations. There is a point about defreezing of bank assets in UK, Portugal, and the United States. And my recommendation is that these assets shall be withdrawn and given to the UNDP or PAHO to buy essential goods and to distribute it under the monitoring of the United Nations to guarantee that humanitarian needs are satisfied. Well, as concerned the civil society, I need to say that regardless of the point, whether they are pro-governmental or anti-governmental, the overwhelming majority of them are against sanctions because they face the problems by their own. For example, private businesses which are not listed can't do any trade because of over-compliance. They have to act with several groups of agents to pay extra and so on. The people from academia, they can't participate in the conferences because the government prefer not to grant them visas and not to sell them tickets. They can't transfer money of private individuals, quite often being against the government. They can't transfer money abroad to buy tickets directly. Quite a lot of them are referring to the fact that their bank accounts have been frozen in Europe and in the United States. And I have even heard the cases when the bank account of the international servants serving in Venezuela have been frozen in Europe or in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question in the end, but I want to now get to the questions that have already been posted in the chat function. Please go ahead with more questions that you have. I'm trying to read as many as I can. There is quite a lot of them. The first question that reached us is the following. Do sanctioning states have structures in place to systematically evaluate the humanitarian consequences of their sanctions? And a follow-up question is, aren't there legal exemptions for humanitarian goods and humanitarian support within these sanctions? Can these exemptions be an angle to ease the suffering of the population?
Well, this question is really broad, and I believe that there is one in chat box which corresponds to the point as concerned the NGOs and humanitarian exemptions being sufficient. Well, unfortunately, one of the problems is that the humanitarian assessment is not done at all. Well, generally speaking, when we look at the terminology, for example, of the US sanctions, it speak that it's easy to get humanitarian exception. There are lots of general licenses, the same about the European Union. But the problem, however, is that, let's say, in practice, it doesn't function. So first of all, because of the fear of secondary sanctions, we got enormous overcompliance, enormous. And I speak about banks, about donors of humanitarian aid, about NGOs. Well, here, I believe I can speak for hours describing the details, but well, if you have questions, I will answer afterwards. But generally speaking, the problem is that sanctions plus the possibility to impose new sanctions fast, plus overcompliance prevents all the trade, including delivery of humanitarian aid. Second point is that humanitarian assessment is usually not done because there is a sort of presumption that, let me cite, our sanctions are targeted, we do not target population. But it doesn't work like that. If you can't buy medicine or food, you do target population, at least because you have counterpartners that do not want to sell anything. Again, when we speak about situation in Venezuela, it's necessary to take into account that all essential public services are state-owned. And that's why if you're a private company dealing with whatever, electricity, water, industry, or whatever, it means that you are dealing with the state. And your partner will say, no, you're dealing with the state. But in the countries where the main essential infrastructure is state-owned, you can't function without dealing with the state. Though it's just impossible practically. And that's why, generally speaking, here is a problem. Recently, the US did a statement that I believe it was 21st of January, 2021, that there is a need to start reassessing and assessing humanitarian impact of sanctions, also on all states, including Venezuela. Now, this mechanism of assessment, I would say they do not exist. Or if they do, they are absolutely ineffective because assessment is not done. That's why I'm happy that the sanctioning countries started to ask questions about that. And not only me, but also NGOs, international humanitarian NGOs, which are involved in the delivery of humanitarian aid. When we speak about the humanitarian exceptions, theoretically, they do exist. As concerned the very limited number of goods, and we speak here about the food, medicine, and medical equipment. In practice, they are non-effective because of overcompliance first, because of the fact that it's necessary, well, in practice, private companies and hospitals showing me that they can't do even a blood test because they have no equipment, no spare parts, and no reagents, so that it's very complicated to deliver medical aid. As for now, after all communications with the interlocutors, I have seen that that's mostly the UNICEF, UNDP, and PAHO, which were able to deliver humanitarian aid. I have also been reported by the church that through the church, some humanitarian aid is also coming to the country. But that's always problematic, and UN agencies refer that they didn't have any impediments and frozen funds, but humanitarian organizations say that they do. Moreover, when we speak about humanitarian exceptions, we need to understand that that's not only, let's say, for food for today or some medicine which you take today. You need medical equipment, which you can't buy. You need spare parts for the medical equipment which you already have. And it has been reported that 80 to 90% of medical equipment in the hospitals are non-functionable. The same comes to reagents. Situation has slightly improved as concerns vaccines after the agreement with PAHO and UNICEF have been concluded and they both started to deliver vaccines, because otherwise they were like numerous incidents of measles, of malaria, of yellow fever, of opportunistic infections, so no treatment was available. And it's also necessary to take into account that, for example, if you do not have electricity, you do not have water, you do not have fuel, and everything is not, you can't store your food or you can't proceed your food. And that basically means that it's also important to get the the spare parts and equipment for maintenance of essential infrastructure. And this part is not provided by any humanitarian exception at all.
I have another question here on humanitarian exceptions from Sonja Hövelmann. I think it's the same. I read it to you, but I think you probably answered it. From your assessment, talk to NGOs, do coercive measures have humanitarian exemptions? And if so, how sufficient and effective are they, given that human suffering is so widespread due to the devastating effects on the population? I think it's kind of what you said. We have a more legal question here as well. The principle of sovereign equality is often abused by states who are not particularly happy to fulfill their human rights obligations with regard to their own citizens in order to delegitimize any form of criticism by other states. Why did you, under your human rights mandate, include a reference to this provision in your preliminary report? Could such a reference not do human rights a disservice by supporting the narrative of those states who themselves show little interest in their human rights obligations?
That's a very interesting question as well. Generally speaking, my approach is purely legalistic on the point. And I will probably start with a reference to the function of another mandate on the human rights while countering international terrorism. If you look back to the resolutions of the UN Security Council at the very beginning, it showed that the world community was very much concerned about the acts of terrorism and requested all states to take all necessary measures to suppress that. But with the course of the time, it started to be obvious that if counterterrorism measures violate human rights, it results in even higher level of international terrorism. And that's why the human rights protection is viewed today as an important and essential preventive means in the struggle against terrorism. The same situation is now. Naturally, no country is ideal. To tell the truth, I do not know any country where no violation of human rights takes place. In some countries, they are violated much more. In some countries, they are violated less. At the same time, I believe that if we want to protect human rights, all states shall work under the rule of law, and all states shall intend to protect human rights. And let's say if sanctions are imposed in violation of international law, and as a result, they violate rights of people whose rights have already been affected by the government, it doesn't help to protect rights of these people. Violation of human rights doesn't help to protect human rights. And again, as concerns the assessment of the situation, that the population which is suffering the most all the time. And upon my opinion, again, as a lawyer, observance of the rule of law from every side is essential for human rights protection, because as practice shows, and I come back to the very first question and the mentioning that economic situation in Venezuela was already not that good by the moment when sanctions have been imposed. If you have enormous sanctions which hurt rights of people, it's pretty easy to say that's only sanctions which did that. And it prevents the dialogue and it prevents the improvements of the situations. So my approach, all parties are to observe international law and to protect human rights. It's not possible to impose sanctions and do enormous humanitarian efforts saying that let the population overthrow the government. That's against international law. Or we have a collateral damage of thousands of people dying, because in practice, indeed, thousands of people are dying.
Yeah, I mean, the rule of law is a bit of a thing, no? I mean, when you were in Venezuela, you were relatively clearly at a state where, the rule of law is arguably not at its very best state. And I mean, Mr. Maduro meets with you, but he does not meet with many of your colleagues, where human rights are in question, human rights violations that his government might have committed. So this is kind of a bit maybe the problem that this question's tried to show, no? That how do you deal with this kind of contradiction in a way, that these governments complain about human rights abuses that sanctions cause, but at the same time, they don't have a clean West themselves, no?
I'm always staying for a comprehensive approach. 2 years ago, the High Commissioner was visiting Venezuela and she produced 2 reports. So the last one has been presented very recently. The first one didn't mention sanctions, the second one did. And I was very pleased to see that, because generally speaking, my mandate covers only a very specific part of the human rights assessment. I do not say that we need to speak only about sanctions when we discuss situation with human rights. When we intend to protect human rights of the population of a specific country, we need to take into account all aspects. Unfortunately, I need to admit that, let's say, problem of human rights violations caused by sanctions quite often is forgotten. And I will refer here to the report which has been produced, for example, the International Labour Organization recently about the situation in Venezuela. That's like 250 pages that request the government to provide good wages, good salaries, social guarantees, and so forth. But let's see, if the government doesn't have money, and its revenue dropped down up to 99%. So they have now only 1% of what they had before sanctions of international revenue. It's physically not possible to provide normal wage without having money at all. So that's part of the problem. And unfortunately, the recommendation of ILO do not take this problem into account. That's why I'm very happy that there is a memorandum of understanding signed between the Office of High Commissioner and the government of Venezuela. And this memorandum of understanding is providing for the visits of 10 special rapporteurs, like 2 per year. And as far as one of my recommendations, again in the report, for both the government and the United Nations to adjust to this memorandum of understanding and do all these country visits first, and secondly, to establish a full-scale office of the High Commissioner in Venezuela to be able to monitor human rights situation, including the impact of sanctions. Because unfortunately, quite often we monitor what the government does, but we absolutely ignore the impact of sanctions. My opinion is that we need to take into account all aspects. The mandate on the impact of sanctions doesn't contradict all other mandates. The point is that we need to assess all possible negative impacts, and only then we will be able to achieve any positive result.
Okay, we have quite a few questions, so I ask you to maybe try to be brief in your answers. We have this question from Rafael Bohlen asking the other way around. Wouldn't the lifting of sanctions further assist the government, elitist structures that have gotten Venezuela in its crisis and are ultimately responsible for the human rights violations? I'll put my light on, by the way. Go answer. And
That's complicated to respond fast to the questions like that. Well, generally speaking, naturally, when we speak about the city, that's why that's important that the High Commissioner and other special rapporteurs come to the countries. But again, nothing can change immediately. The UN agencies are reporting to the increasing level of cooperation of the government with Venezuela with the international agencies. We can't expect anything to change immediately. And we need to take into account that, for example, let's think about people who used to have pretty low income. Before 2016, before sanctions were imposed, they used to get the full medical coverage, possibility to buy food normally, free education, school forms, computers for schooling. Today, they have nothing to eat, and they depend 100% on the social support from the side of the government, including the food. They can't get medical treatment and vaccination, and they are dying. Naturally, these people, and the majority of these people in Venezuela, they are against sanctions. And in responding to these questions, I checked the reports of the independent agencies, the international organizations, and so forth. And basically, these reports say that the population started to be very much against opposition because of the sanctions. They are probably not in favor that much of the government, but they are much, let's say, they do not support the opposition right now, taking into account that they are at the level of starvation and they survive only because of the support of the government at that point. So generally speaking, there is no structured and strong opposition in Venezuela right now. As concerns the possibility, the second part of the question of new corruption or whatever else, naturally it's possible in every state. Well, that's why, for example, I paid attention to the secrecy clauses of anti-blockade law. It's important to make the process transparent. But let's see, if the private companies are scared to have any deals with Venezuela companies, they do not want their names to be known. And basically, I have been reported by the companies that do not want the identity to be disclosed. Naturally, there are lots of questions and lots of problems, and that's why I believe that hope that the Office of High Commissioner will be established and it will be possible to monitor all the problems in this field.
We have a few more questions. I'll read out this one. This was given without a name. I believe that corruption, lack of transparency, and lack of rule of law are a fundamental part of bad governance in countries like Venezuela. And I also believe that they are part of the reasons for human rights violations. Because as you said before, this situation has been happening before the sanctions. So my question is, what was your recommendation to the government of Venezuela so that they themselves stop violating the human rights of their citizens?
That's one of the questions I'm usually asked, but again, I need to remind that as a special rapporteur, I need to stay within the scope of the mandate. Mm-hmm. I'm not allowed to analyze the situation of what is not concerned with sanctions. When I did the country visit, I assessed the legality of measures taken, humanitarian impact, and naturally, I can't say that exactly 5,000 people died in 2017 only because of sanctions. But I see the tendency and I see the increase of these deaths. So to identify humanitarian effect as well as to observe the situation with delivery of humanitarian aid and any impediments both from outside and from the side of the government. And that's why, again, when I come to my recommendations, they are not only about lifting sanctions, they are about releasing assets under the UN control, distribution with the UN monitoring that will provide the possibility to avoid the corruption or any misuse and to provide fair distribution. They about drafting legislation about functioning of NGOs in transparent, clear manner to guarantee their security.
Okay, we have another longer question. Thanks to the interest group of ISIL and the IFHV for organizing this event. Thanks also for Professor Thielbörger and to the Special Rapporteur. Besides being a member of ISIL, I'm diplomat and the Deputy Permanent Representative of Greece to the United Nations in Geneva. Therefore, I would like to ask the Special Rapporteur, given the opposition she mentioned that there is to her mandate by some states, how she can, from a point of view of international law, emphasize in forthcoming reports the nexus, the connection between human rights and unilateral coercive measures. And I'm asking this in both ways, how much violate human rights and how tend to uphold human rights.
The purpose of my mandate is to make sure that the application of unilateral sanctions doesn't violate human rights. People who didn't get medical treatment or have no food, or for example, I have been reported about women which come to deliver baby with hemoglobin being 10 instead of 120 and who are dying because of that. Their right to life is violated. And these what shouldn't happen in this situation. That's why I see a clear nexus in this situation. If we want to guarantee that human rights are observed, we all, both sanctioning states or sanctioned states or United Nations, shall act in accordance with international law and shall take all possible measures to prevent any negative humanitarian impact. It's not possible to guarantee the rule of law by violating law. It's not possible to improve human rights situation by taking action which makes people to die or prevent them from studying. For example, when we speak about situation in Venezuela, there are two UNESCO statements and like prize in Venezuela, for example, for elimination of illiteracy or for elimination of computer illiteracy. We shouldn't think about situation in black and white only. We need to assess it in general, and that's why I want to say that assessment of negative impact on human rights of unilateral sanctions is an important part of human rights observance mechanism. Yes, it's possible to put a pressure on the state, but only in the legal way.
I have one follow-up question to a previous question, and then I would conclude with my own question so that in 5 minutes we can finish. Thanks for your answer on sovereign equality before. Maybe a brief follow-up. If I understand that, but why was the reference to the principle of sovereign equality needed? The favorite rhetorical device against human rights. wouldn't it be enough to state in your report that sanctions violate human rights?
Again, there are several levels of the problem. As I said, the very first one is the assessment of the situation from the point of law. And from the point of international law, states are sovereign and the sovereignty is equal. That basically means that one state can't say that we believe that the government is another one is so bad that we want to impose sanctions to overthrow the government. If the population is not happy, international law provides for the possibility of population to change the government in different ways. At the same time, it's not allowed for one state to say that another state is a failed state, or for example, is not a sovereign anymore, and we need to change the government, or for example, as we speak about the maximum pressure doctrine, we will impose sanctions until the Maduro government is changed. It has nothing to do with international law. That's why I say that international law shall be in the middle of all the discussion in the sphere of protection of human rights.
Before I come to my final question, there's one more question, and I find it very interesting. That's why I want to also ask it by Vanessa Blieke. How are the persons leaving Venezuela protected under international law? Are they qualified as refugees, and are they, oh, there was just gone away. I don't know. I couldn't finish reading the question. So are they qualified as refugees? How are they protected? Those 5 million or 1.2 million million people leaving the country, and are the receiving states supported by the international community? Sorry.
That's a non-easy question, I would say. The first point is that it's necessary to take into account that lots of countries in this region, they cooperate very actively, and the people cross the border very easily. They do not even need a passport. They can use their original ID. So they are migrating quite often. There was a situation, for example, that at certain point, 3 million of Colombians were living in Venezuela for several years. So usually people are migrating freely and then are not let's say applying for the refugee status. I need to mention that, for example, today for people living in Venezuela, the transportation itself is much more problematic because there is no fuel. There are no money, so they basically are walking through the whole Venezuela, and quite often they do not have the possibility to eat. So I talked to some institutions which are establishing something like houses or canteens where these people can stay for a night and have at least some hot meal or any meal as such. As concerns the application for refugee status, let's see, the majority of them do not apply for that. Naturally, I believe that some of them probably do, but let's see, I didn't meet people who said that they received a refugee status in any other state when living in Venezuela. I presume that there are such people, but the majority of them do not apply to this status. And as an example, when pandemic has started, quite a lot of people came from the neighboring countries back to Venezuela. Now, some of them are staying in Venezuela, some of them are leaving, but they are not applying for refugee status.
And the receiving states, do they receive support? That was the second half of the question.
As concerned the receiving states, I have heard that there are some problems with for the newborn children to get IDs in some countries. In some countries, that's not a problem. Venezuela is providing IDs. As far as I know, Venezuela is not supporting them financially when they leave, but they basically
for the international community. I mean, not only.
As far as I know, some of the neighboring countries received some sort of support to support Venezuela people being in that countries. But here again, I need to confess that the information is very contradictory. Some of them said that there was enormous support to the international support to provide finance and shelter for Venezuelan in neighboring countries. However, for example, some other sources said that these people didn't get this support. And now I do not want to speculate. I can only state that information is contradictory and quite often opposing each other.
I reserve the right of the last question. You have told us that the states should lift their sanctions. And we have also heard about the dire situation. And of course, not all of that is, falling from the heavens. It also has to do with the government. I think we can agree on that. What should the international community then do? If we are supposed to lift sanctions, what else is the way for Venezuela from an international perspective? I mean, I know you have given these recommendations to the Maduro government, what they can do. I understand that's also what you do. You don't only advise the international community, you also advise the governments. You said that, you stressed that. But what should the international community do? I mean, should we just hope that all of a sudden, the government turns around and has a different attitude towards human rights? Or what other means of influencing, if not to say putting pressure on this government, does the international community have, if not unilateral coercive sanctions?
Well, I want to repeat my initial statements as concerns for legal mechanism of pressure when we speak about the UN Security Council, when we speak about the legal measures, countermeasures, as well as the possibility of international criminal jurisdiction. My opinion is that the main point what international community shall do is to observe international law. And that means to use these four means. Second recommendation, which I'm doing in lots of my reports, and I did in Venezuela one as well, was to use competent international bodies for settlement of various types of disputes. And by the way, today we observed an enormous increase of bringing sanctions or sanction-related cases to the international justice. When I will cite situation in Venezuela, there are 2 referrals submitted to the International Criminal Court. One is submitted against Venezuela, alleging that Venezuela has committed international crimes, but another one is submitted by Venezuela, referring that sanctioning states have committed international crimes, which results in thousands of deaths. And that's a legal means of settlement of the disputes and bring those who are responsible to justice. Naturally, international law is not perfect, and we all are unhappy about that. We complain to our students, to our colleagues, but nevertheless, that's the law what we have today. If some other changes are supposed to happen, I believe that there is a need to negotiate new international legal norms. But unfortunately, taking measures, I would say, to feel happy that we are concerned and we do something doesn't justify thousands of people dying because of this doing something. We need to act in accordance with the rule of law and to take into account that it doesn't affect human rights. I always call people, please try to apply these consequences to yourself. Let's imagine that you yourself do not have water, electricity, no food, no job, no possibility for medical aid, and your children are dying because of not being able to get that or dying of malnutrition. Are you sure that it's possible to sacrifice someone else's lives in the same situation if naturally none of us wants to face this situation for our own?
Yeah, that's maybe something for all of us to take away and consider. I think many of us can certainly not imagine to be in such a situation. Thank you very, very much, Alena, for taking the time. Thank you very much for all the people who have joined us today. I have to say we were more than 50 people. We are still 44 people, so only very few people have left the talk while it's already so late in the day, which I take as a very good sign. Thank you, Alena, so much again for taking the time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the ESIL interest group members who are here today. Thank you to the IFHV members who are here today. Thanks for Will, who helped organizing this event, and others who were involved in organizing it. So thank you very much and have a good evening, everyone.
I also want to thank you for organization of the event and for a wonderful stay in Bochum for the whole semester and being able to teach there. And probably at the last point, what I want to mention is that I believe that we need enormous academic attention to be paid to the problem of unilateral sanctions and consequences of unilateral sanctions. I'm always calling for everyone to submit their academic opinion on the problem. The call for contribution is still on the webpage of my mandate. I extended the deadline until the end of March. So everyone is welcome to submit the contribution, because this year my report for the Human Rights Council will be devoted to the notion and characteristics and qualification of unilateral sanctions, and the report to the General Assembly will be devoted to the notion of targets as well as humanitarian exceptions. So everyone is welcome.
Thank you very much, Alena. It was a pleasure to have you today and also over the last month. Stay healthy, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.